with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goeth to Betharon, and smote them at Azahek, and unto Makkedah. And it came to pass that they fled from before Israel, and were in the going down to Betharon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah. And they died. They were more which died from the hailstones than they who the children of Israel slew with the sword. Then Joshua spake unto the Lord that day, when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jashar? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven, and hasted not to the going down about a whole day. And there was no day like it before or after, that the Lord hearkened unto his voice, a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So we've talked already for several weeks about how at this point the Gibeonites had surrendered. Do we remember this? And so they had no weapons, they had no means of fighting for themselves. And upon making this covenant with Israel, the Gibeonites laid down their right to fight. They were now dependent slaves. That being the case, how silly, how ridiculous, how absurd it would have been for the Gibeonites to now, in their surrendered state, try to take on these invading kingdoms. To feel as if these surrendered slaves, as if it were up to them to win this battle. Yet instead, what we've been talking about is the fact that the Gibeonites knew whose side they were now on. They knew that that same God who brought down Jericho's walls, the same God that annihilated Ai, the same God who brought Egypt to its knees, the same God that parted the Red Seas, the same God who dried up the Jordan, that same God was now within reach. He was now accessible to them. That same God who could do the impossible against all odds was now available and accessible, and it changed everything in this scene. And so we see in this scene that the Gibeonites, who were once the enemies of God, they are now granted victory simply because they now had access to heaven's storehouse. So how did they have this access? How did they have the supply of hailstones and the supply of the sun standing still? How did these once undeserving heathens, these Canaanite castaways, how did they now have access to the mighty God of Israel? The answer, as we talked last week, was via Joshua, that channel, that conduit, God's chosen vessel. You see it there on the last verse that we read there. The man. He'd never hearkened unto the voice of a man before. And so the Gibeonites learned to cooperate with their creator. How? By placing their faith in his chosen channel. By placing their faith in his chosen conduit and allowing him to bring the results about. Are y'all with me? And so, because they had faith in God's chosen conduit, they now had they had rocks falling from the sky, killing the army. They have the sun and the moon standing still. In other words, all of creation was now cooperating with them because they were now cooperating with the Creator. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but have y'all ever had those holy sanctified moments where God gets your attention, where you're going out the door and you know this little thing right here? It catches the door. Anybody ever been there? Got caught by the door handle. That is God's sovereign way of telling you he is in control and you are not. I'm convinced of that. When that happens to me, it's one of those signs that, listen, when you're not right with God, listen, he is in control of all things, even the little belt loops on my pants. And when you're not cooperating with him, all of creation stops cooperating with you. Have you ever felt that way before? Like everything is going wrong and you know it's because you're not right with God. Talk about Jonah, right? That's the story. But the reverse is true for the believer. When you are right with God, when you remain cooperative with your Creator, do you know all of creation works to your benefit for his glory? Have you ever thought about that? That's what we're going to talk about today. So take a look at a verse you may have heard before once or twice. We're going to look at John chapter 15. The Bible says this: I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself except it abide in the vine. No more can ye except ye abide in me. Jesus says, I am the vine, and ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch that is withered, and a man gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If ye abide in me, and my words abide in you, ye shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done unto you. Herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit, so shall ye be my disciples. By a raise of hands this morning, how many of you have gardens or have ever gardened? Why do people do that? That's my first question this morning. Why? Why would you do that? That just sounds like, yeah, we won't go down that rabbit trail. But why do people garden? That is where I'd like to start this morning. Why do gardeners garden? Those of you who garden will appreciate the fact that it takes work. Would you agree? Gardening successfully takes work, right? It's dirty, it's laborsome, it's sweaty, it's hot. Jenny was informing me yesterday about corn sweat, something I never knew I needed to know about, okay? There are bugs, there are weeds, there are rodents. It's a lot of work to garden. And yet the entire reason that a gardener goes through all of these efforts to plant something is because the gardener has a desired outcome. Would you agree that's why a gardener gardens? What is that desired outcome? Well, they want fruit and or vegetables. That's the only reason you would garden. You have something that you want. You have something that you want to come to pass, something you want to see happen, AKA fruit, vegetable. And so therefore you garden. And so the only logical reason to plant is if you want produce. All right, shaking of heads, we understand this analogy, we understand. So then how does a gardener get this desired outcome? How does a gardener get the fruit, get the vegetable? Well, you all who garden know it's not by speaking the tomato into existence. You go home and try that. Make sure you take a video and send it to me. It's not by wiggling your nose for more means of beans, right? Gardeners don't yell at the leaves, fruit! That's not how you garden, right? I don't do it, so you tell me, that's not how you garden? Okay. Okay, well, I had a feeling that I needed to do more research. Okay, so a gardener brings about fruit, how? By providing what is needed to the root. Is that how you garden? Everybody help Ensel out. Is that how you garden correctly? I don't know how they do it in Vickery, but that's how we do it in the rest of the world. The way that you garden is providing what is needed to make fruit. You provide that to the root, right? Any hope, any desire, any will on the part of the gardener is fulfilled by first planting a seed and then pouring into the seed and then providing for, supplying for the root of that plant all that it needs so that the root can grow branches and the branches can grow fruit. That is how the will of the gardener is fulfilled. You know, like, wow, I didn't need to come here today. I've been doing that for years. Take that understanding of gardening and apply that to what Jesus says here. Who is the gardener in this scene? God is the gardener. That's what Jesus starts with. He says, my Father, he's the husbandman. We would understand that to be God is the gardener. God is the one who has a will. God is the one who has a desire. He has an outcome that he wants to produce, AKA fruit, right? He has something he desires to see happen. Take a look again at this verse 8. Do you recognize that any and all fruit that comes about in the Christian life is a result of the will of God? In other words, the only explanation for any and all spiritual fruit is for God's glory. Y'all read that verse for yourselves. For herein is my Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit. That's the purpose of his planting. That's the plan for his pruning, and that's the priority of this produce, that God the gardener would be glorified. Now, that may seem obvious to you, and that might be very seemingly unhelpful, but how often do we lose sight of that? Why did God create you? For his glory. Why did he save you? For his glory. Why did he provide you with all that you need for life and godliness? For his glory. It's not so that you can live your best life now. He didn't do all of that so that you can live peacefully in heaven someday. The very reason you exist, the very reason you have even a single flicker of righteousness in your life, the reason that you can live abundantly, the reason you can walk victoriously, the reason you will be in heaven someday is for his glory. Do you recognize that? Why do we as believers not lie? For his glory. Why do we refrain from the wickedness of this world? For our King's glory. Why do we do ministry around here? For his glory. Why do we not get entangled with the debates of this world and this place and this land? Why? For his glory. Are you all seeing a pattern here? All fruit is for his glory. Now, don't we lose sight of that a lot of times? Especially growing up in church. I have to do this because I'm supposed to. I don't know about you, but that was a lot of times the business line answer given in church. Why? Because you're supposed to. That's not what the Bible says. It's not even good English. Why do we do everything we do as a Christian? Why do we live the Christian life? It is all for his glory. Some of us would like to live a lot more victoriously, and some of us would live a lot more joy-filled if we would remember that whatsoever we do, we are to do for the glory of God. So then, since fruit is the will of God, fruit is what he is desiring to produce, fruit is his purpose, God the gardener is then the one that is orchestrating. He's planting, he's watering, he's pruning, he's supplying, he's providing to this plant for his purpose. Are you with me? The gardener is the one who ensures the plant has the needed nutrition. The gardener, God the gardener, he's the one who has the storehouse of supplies, if you will. He has all that a plant will need. He has the pruning shears. He has the pesticides. He has the watering can. He has the scarecrow. He has the fertilizer. He has everything a plant needs to thrive and survive. And so he, God the gardener, brings about his will. How? How does God bring about his will here on this earth? By supplying to the root all that it needs to bear fruit. Shaking of heads, are you with me? Are you with me? Are you with me? Listen, if this is very important for some of us to hear. If the gardener doesn't do it, it doesn't happen. How many of you have a garden and can attest to that? Like, you do not see thriving gardens in the wild naturally. Right? You don't see gardens just flourishing when no one's paying attention. The only way a healthy garden takes place is if the gardener loves and cares for and gives TLC and just labors and toils and works on this garden. In other words, any good garden, any fruit comes about by the gardener's efforts, not by the plant's efforts. A plant's desperately dependent on God, on the gardener. A plant is desperately dependent for everything. Protection from the weeds, protection from the coons, protection from the mice, protection from the rabbits, protection from the insects. Is dependent on the gardener for the sun and the water and everything it needs. The plant does nothing but depend on the supply of the gardener. Who's the gardener, folks? God is our gardener. God, the gardener, has the will. He has the supply, and he does the work to see a plant produce. Now, you all stop right there. Can we all just agree it's good to be a plant and not to be the gardener? Am I alone? And yet, how many of us live our lives as if it's up to us? Imagine you go to your garden tomorrow morning and what you got? Tomatoes, beans, I don't know what you plant. Both. Imagine you go to your tomato plant tomorrow and you start to pour the watering can upon it and the tomato plant smacks you across the face and says, "No, I'll do it." You would see how that is wildly absurd, And you probably need to get yourself checked out, right? Right? Do you see how we do that to God all the time? He created us as a plant, as something that is by design solely dependent upon him. And yet we want to provide for ourselves. We want to do the work. We want to be the gardener. Am I alone here this morning? You realize that when you walk up to a healthy tomato plant, you may see this stalk, this stem, and you may see its branches, and you may see it full of bright red tomatoes, and you might be tempted to congratulate that stalk, that stem, that branch on this fruit that it's produced. And yet what we know is that the only reason there are any fruit on this tomato plant is because of the root that has been provided for. Take away the root, there's no fruit. A stalk, a stem, a tomato plant that is being fully provided for, that has plenty of tomatoes on it, is only receiving and making, right? It's the gardener providing the work, it's the roots receiving, and it's the branch producing. Are you all seeing this picture? Jesus says that while God is the gardener, who's the gardener? God is the gardener. He says, I, Jesus, am the vine. Notice this. This was our lesson last week. Notice that Jesus says, I'm not the gardener. Do you recognize that? God is the gardener. My Father's the husbandman. Jesus says, I'm the vine. Jesus says, he's the supplier. He's the one with a will. He's the one who is making this happen. Instead of me being the gardener, Jesus says, I'm the one who receives from God. I'm the root. I'm the vine. In order to produce and provide the outcome, the will, the fruit that God desires. Take a look at John 5:30. Jesus says this. Jesus talking. Jesus says this about Jesus. I can of my own self do nothing. Is Jesus allowed to say that? As I hear, Jesus says, I judge. And my judgment is just because I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. Look at what he says in John 14:10. Believest thou not that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak, they're not my own, but the Father that dwelleth in me, he does the work. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the very works themselves. Jesus says, I, the vine, I, the root, can do nothing. I only receive what God gives. I only receive from God the gardener. He does the work. And so if you see fruit coming out of the life of Jesus, guess what? It's only by reason of God the gardener providing to the root all that's needed for fruit. Jesus says, I am not the gardener. I can of my own self do nothing. I'm the vine. Jesus says, I'm the receptor. I receive whatever the Father places within me. Jesus says that God does the work. It's not Jesus, the vine, that's making fruit. It's not Jesus, the vine, that walked on water or raised the dead or healed the sick. It's God in Jesus, the gardener, in the vine. He does the work. He produces the fruit. We know that so often, we quote all the time around here in the book of John, we read Jesus saying that he only does what the Father says to do. He only goes where the Father says to go. He only says what the Father says to say. Jesus was a man, a vine dependent on the leading, the supplying, the tending of God the gardener at all times. His life was placed fully into the hands of his Father, the farmer. God is the, and Jesus is the vine. But Jesus goes on to say, there's one more concept here. Because not only is God the gardener, not only is Jesus the vine, but he says you're the branch. You're the evidence of this fruit. You are God's demonstration here on earth. Jesus says you connect to me, the vine, so that his care as the gardener, his supply through me can get to you so that you, the branch, can bear fruit. Grasp this. On your own, you cannot be good. You cannot be righteous. You cannot be worthy. On your own, you have zero good works. You can never, ever, at any time please God or ever produce fruit or ever fulfill his will. On your own, Jesus says, you can do Nothing. And so the only way for you to get from God the thing that you need to do his will is by remaining in connectivity to Jesus. You could say this: connectivity leads to productivity. Fruit comes only by means of root. Your only hope, your only chance, your only way of ever receiving anything whatsoever from God is if it passes through Jesus. It is solely because you have been grafted into him as a branch that you now receive the fullness of God. Listen, how can I faithfully read my Bible and actually enjoy it? It's not by you trying harder. It's not by you making it happen. It's only by God giving you his desires in your heart for his word, placed into the life of Jesus, provided to you. That's the only way the Bible will ever work in your life. How can you love the unlovable, especially come November 4th? How can you love the unlovable? It's not by grinning and bearing it. It's not by putting on a fake face. The only way you can love the way that he loved is if God gives you his love to Jesus, the root, in you to produce that love in fruit. Are y'all with me? Jesus says, like the branch, without the vine, you can do. I am fully persuaded that today in Christianity, this is one of the most lacking truths that we need reminded of so often. We can do nothing. We can completely, totally, diabolically do nothing apart from him. Listen, we cannot produce a single speck of fruit apart from him. No fashion of godliness, no type of righteousness in and of ourselves. Any and absolutely every good thing that comes from your life, listen, it's in spite of you. No matter how hard a plant tries, a plant cannot make fruit on its own. No matter how much a branch believes, it cannot grin and bear it. It cannot make it happen. It can't give its best effort. It can't give more exertion. Listen, simply because of what it is, simply because of its design, branches cannot bear fruit on its own. Do you remember, do you recognize, go back to Genesis 1. Do you recognize who designed the plant? In the beginning, God himself designed the plant. Do you know when he spoke plantation into existence, he knew the design then that he would illustrate us now? In other words, when he designed the plant, the design was this: plants can't do it on their own. Plants must depend. The only hope for fruit is by means of root. Yet how many of us grew up in church and were told to do it? Try harder, work harder, fruit. Jesus says, no. God designed this, and he had no mistake in doing it. You are the plant. The only way you'll have fruit is by trusting in him, the root. So until we stop trying and start relying, we will be fruitless. Do we understand this? So if this is true, your only job here, your greatest need, your sole purpose in this life by design, what you were created for, Jesus says, is to abide. I know we've given this definition a bajillion times, it seems like. You should be able to quote me this definition by now. But let me show you what the Greek word meno means. The word abide, it means this: remain, tarry, not to depart, continue to be present, kept continually, endure, survive, live, await for, or wait for. Do you recognize that is your sole responsibility as a believer? Folks, hear me clearly this morning. You are not required to keep one single command on your own. Do I need to say that again? Does that undo all your gears of Christianity? You, in and of yourself, are not commanded to keep one dot or tittle, one iota from this book on your own. Why? Because Jesus said you can't. Your job is to Abide. You're not instructed to live out one single Bible verse as yourself. Your job, your priority, your focus, your fixation as a Christian is to abide, to remain, to tarry, to not depart, to continue, to endure, to survive, to live, to wait upon. That's your job here. That's your role here. That's what is required of you. Just like a plant waiting on the gardener for all that it needs, you are to abide. Listen, I'm learning more and more every day. It seems like daily I'm learning that this is the linchpin to Christianity. I truly believe this. Like if I will just abide in him, if I will just refuse to let go, if I will survive by him, well, I have everything I need. Listen, that abiding is more important than ministry. Abiding is more important than anything we could ever do here. Clinging to Christ, seeking him in everything, in every moment, refusing to let go. That is the key to Christianity. That's the road to the abundant, victorious Christian life. Take a look at what Jesus prays in John 17. And the glory which thou gavest me, Jesus, I have given them, that they may be one as we are one. I, Jesus says, I and them, and thou, God, you and me, that they may be made perfect in one, and that the world may know that thou sent me and hast loved them as thou hast loved me. Do you see how this is fruit and root language? I and them and me. You and me and I and them. That's how they become perfect. Do you see this? This is fruit and root language, fruit and root. Do y'all want to say that? I see your smirks. You're like, this is serious, but I have to smile. Fruit and root. Everyone say it for me. Do you feel better? I feel better. All right. Do you realize this fruit and root concept? You realize that's how Jesus lived his life as a vine? He was made available to God. That's what we talked about last week. He was made available to God to produce fruit through his life. And then Jesus prays that his followers would remain as one, remain in connectivity to him, God, at all times, so that God, through Jesus in us, could be seen. How? Jesus says, it's by me in them, and by you, God, you in me. That's how they will be made perfect. Do you see that in this verse? Did I lose y'all right there? Y'all, do we need to read this again? The goal of Christianity is to be ye perfect as he is perfect. How do we do that? It's not by keeping the Big Ten. It's not by trying our hardest. It's not by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. How do we live a holy, perfect life? It is by God and Jesus in us. You and me and them, Jesus says. That's how they are made perfect. Is that how you're living? Is that what you're dependent upon? Jesus says it's by me and them, and you, God, you and me. That is how they are made perfect. That's how this world will know that they're mine. Look at the verse. Listen, it's not by your WWJD t-shirt. It's not by your honk if you love Jesus bumper sticker. It's not by your Darwin eating Jesus fish on your car. It's not by your social media statuses, right? How will the world know you are one of his? By him and me and you. They're made perfect, and the world will know. Do you realize that receiving of God via Jesus, receiving as a branch from the vine, from the gardener, that is the key to Christianity? If you will do this, if you will abide, then Jesus the vine, he will provide to you all that God the gardener has in his supply house, just like Joshua in Joshua chapter 10. Just like Jesus lived his life on earth, God, by Jesus, through you, will then do and keep and obey and live out all that this book says, if you'll abide. God the gardener will produce fruit by Jesus, the root in you. Jesus reminds us that without him we can do nothing, but if you will abide in me, if you will cling to me and refuse to depart, as the vine, Jesus says, I will provide to you the limitless resource of God the gardener. As a vine, I will give to you the branch, everything that the Father gives to me, now supplied to you. Look up here. Does that change anything for your Christianity? that you're not looking in your own pockets to pull this thing off. You're not trying to make this happen on your own. Listen, when he called you to be a Christian, he gave you the limitless access of godliness, of God himself, God in us. All that he's waiting on us to do is to abide. I know this is my spiritual soapbox. I know that this is something that I feel very strongly about and talk about it very often. But do you see how this is completely contradictory to what most of Christianity teaches? Is that right? Like, how differently would our lives look if instead of memorizing the 10 Commandments, if instead of being told the cutesy Bible stories, how different would our lives look if from a young age it was instilled in us regularly that the core message of the Bible, the entire message of the gospel, is that you can't, so God did. The entire point of God's word is that you're not able, so God will do through you what you cannot do yourself. Would that change how you would have lived your life up until this point? Would that change those kids in that classroom next to us if they learned that now? I make practice, Jenny and Juliet can tell you this. Juliet just is very annoyed by it, but I'm the dad. I make practice of any time Juliet goes anywhere, whether it's school, Sunday school, junior church, discipleship, anywhere she goes, whenever she's learning something about God, about the Bible, I will ask her, what did you learn? I want to know what's being poured into that little girl. That's my responsibility. So the other day, we were coming out of somewhere, and she got in the car. It was just the two of us, I believe. And so as usual, I said, Juliet, what did you learn? And she went on to tell me that she learned that the way that we get to heaven is by keeping the 10 Commandments. I hit the brakes on that car so fast, probably scared her to death. She probably thought someone was dying or she was in big trouble. I hit the brakes in that car. I whipped my seatbelt off and turned around. I said, what did you say? She said, well, we learned that if you keep the 10 Commandments, you can go to heaven. I said, oh, let me stop you right there. I said, baby, you realize that you can never keep the 10 Commandments. And your only hope of ever making it into heaven is if you depend on Jesus Christ and his completed work and his continual work in and through you. Do you realize it is Jesus that does this, not you? Yes, Dad. I said, if you ever have anyone tell you that in a class again, you stop them and say, no, it's because of Jesus that we get to heaven. I said, repeat that back to me. She said, it's because of Jesus. Say it again. Jesus gets us to heaven, Dad. I said, don't you forget it. How many of you are glad you're not being raised by me? Amen. And so thank you. Not this time. So, folks, that's a little bit humorous, but I fully believe that. And I am completely convinced that at her age, she needs to hear very regularly, Juliet, Elizabeth, Sorrell, you can do nothing. So stop trying and start abiding, because it's only by clinging to him that you will ever be a Christian. Folks, if we're counting on ourselves to be Christians, we will never live Christianity. The truth is, we're not prepared to receive all that God has for us until we accept just how much we really can do nothing on our own. We will never produce fruit until we become desperately dependent upon Christ, the root. If instead of being taught to try harder, to want it more, to believe more, if we were instead taught to abide, to live, to survive, to cling to refuse, to let go of Jesus, and that all those things will be done by him through you, do you realize we'd see a lot more authenticity in Christianity today? There'd be no room for pride. I'm just a plant in the dirt, waiting for the root to give me from God the gardener. The world would come to know him because they would then realize that the foot of the cross is level ground. We all have access to the same supply of heaven himself. Folks, can I ask you this morning humbly, can you honestly say you have learned just how futile your self-efforts are? Not just in word. We get here in Sunday school and we can do nothing. That's how I hear you guys. I don't know what you sound like. Do you realize it's really easy to chant that It's really easy to put that on your wall, on your coffee mug, and your t-shirt. I have all three. It's really easy to say that as a mantra, but it's a whole other thing to live that in reality. Have you come to realize that apart from Jesus Christ, apart from his supply from the Heavenly Father, you can do absolutely nothing? Listen, how often do we find ourselves trying to be a Christian? How frequently do you still find yourself trying to do instead of allowing him to be? How many times do you get frustrated with yourself because you're just not getting it? You just can't seem to get it right. What you need to do is stop trying and start relying, start abiding, start cooperating with the Creator in and through you. Just like the Gibeonites, recognize that you have access to God and his supply of godliness, God in us. And by faith, allow Jesus to be the channel, the conduit that gives you victory in your Christianity. Major Ian Thomas says this. This is one of my favorite quotes of all times by him. You can't. He never said that you could. By design, a plant can do nothing on its own. God designed me to be the Christian. God designed me to be the abider. God designed me to be the receptor. And so by design, that God got right, by design, I, the Christian, well, I can't do it. But by design, he never said that I could. He goes on to say, he can, and he always said he would. Folks, are you cooperating with your Creator? Are you allowing him to be God in and through you? Are you relying upon his supply to live out your salvation? Do you believe him by faith when he says that you can do nothing, but through him there is nothing he cannot do? I don't know what the equivalent, so the Old Testament, we talked about this a few weeks ago, the Old Testament is the physical representation of the spiritual realities. You remember this? You remember this? Wilma does. The rest of you can join us when we get there. So in the Old Testament, we see this amazing story of how Joshua, for the Gibeonites, taps into God's storehouse in the heavens, and rocks from the sky wipe out the army. And the sun stands still, and the moon stands still. Amazing supply from God through Joshua to the Gibeonites. I don't know what the equivalent of that is spiritually in the New Testament, but can I tell you I want that? Like everyone watching Joshua and Gibeon that day, they weren't scratching their head like, wow, that was a cool magic trick, Joshua. They weren't scratching their heads like, oh, I could probably do that, right? They knew, matter-of-factly, that this was an intervention of the Almighty. I want that to be my definition of the spiritual life that I live. Or, as Jesus puts it in John 10, he came not to give us life, but life more abundantly. Do you want that? Not only do you want that, but do you recognize you have access to that? You are connected to the root. He can produce abundant fruit. Are you letting him? Let's all stand.